Okay, with your permission, we'll start and get the meeting underway. There are two sessions today, and they both deal with the civil rights period in Northern Ireland, and they're prompted by the fact that this year marks the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Civil Rights Association. The first session, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement, a Missed Opportunity. I'll be speaking with Tony, who'll introduce it. But my main thing I want to say is introduce the chair for this session, who's Declan de Bredon, who's an eminent journalist and commentator, who's somebody who is familiar with the topic, who's covered it over the years, who has always taken a very progressive stance in relation to it. And if it's not too much to say, he is a journalist who is a credit to his profession.
Thank you for those kind words. I think my invitation here came as a result of a piece. I do a column in the Irish News on Monday, every second Monday, and I wrote a bit about the previous event of this kind that was held in Belfast earlier in the year. Dermot O'Doherty, who's in the audience, actually recently presented me with an article I'd forgotten that I'd written. It was an obituary in The Guardian of Desmond Greaves, which was published on the 2nd of September 1988, where I described him as that rare phenomenon, an Irish Marxist historian. For 40 years, editor of the Irish Democrat, wrote biographies of James Connolly and Liam Mellows, a great friend of Sean O'Casey, whom he described as, quote, gloriously cantankerous, unquote. A member of the Communist Party of Great Britain for more than 50 years. He wanted to see a British withdrawal from the north, though not a precipitate one. Quote, you couldn't do a Katanga, he said. In fact, this was all based on an interview I had done with him 2 years before. He believed not only that Irish republicanism, but the entire Irish nation was essentially radical by its birthright, because Ireland lost her aristocratic leaders when they fled to Spain after the Battle of Kinsale in the early 17th century, leaving only the middle class in the way of revolutionary change. I think they're still in the way, actually. He saw the EEC, as it then was, NATO, and multinational companies as dangers to Irish nationality. I had the privilege of attending a memorial event in Dublin when he died, where the speakers included the late Kader Asmal, and I put in a search for Greaves and Asmal into the Irish Times archive, and instead of getting, I thought I might have done a report on it, instead of getting that, I got a front page story that I'd done based in 2005, based on the Irish archives, the state archives, which was headed Army Intelligence Monitored Anti-EEC Campaigners. A secret file on a leading opponent of EEC entry, Mr. Anthony Coughlin, which has been declassified under the 30-year rule, shows the extent of monitoring by military intelligence. A secret handwritten report dated 20th of June 74 indicates a high level of surveillance. The report notes that, quote, Tony Coughlin has been invited to a conference of the British Irish Association in Oxford on weekend 5-7 July 74. He has arranged to pass through London on 4 or 5 July. He is likely to stay with Desmond Greaves overnight. A file was also kept on Mr. Greaves, which sets out his travel plans as follows. Greaves will be in Liverpool first week in March, London 8th to 11th of March, Liverpool 12th, 15th of March, travelling in England 16th to 26th of March, London 27th to 31st of March. And there was a body called the External Research Group, which both of these gentlemen were involved in, which had held its third meeting in Dublin in 1974. The meeting discussed informally the theory and practice of developing a broad-based movement for democracy, unity and independence as a credible alternative to the Fianna Fáil versus coalition type of politics. Among the participants understood to be present, the report continues, were Mr. Coughlin, anti-apartheid campaigner Akadir Asmal, and the scientist Dr. Roy Johnson, whom we are pleased to see here. So, I'm going to introduce Tony Coughlin, first speaker.
I was asked a few months ago to write some articles for the monthly Village magazine. I did two on the civil rights movement and the NICRA part of it, and they've been distributed. It's a very large and complex movement, and in the next 25 or 30 minutes I can only refer to a few points, which are really elaborations of points made in that article, which people can take away with them. And also I see that Sean Redmond's pamphlet on Desmond Greaves and the civil rights movement has been republished by the Conlon Association and is available here. So these will elaborate on the background to the civil rights movement, which I want to say something about now. As you know, the Government of Ireland Act 1920 passed at Westminster, partitioned Ireland and has set up the Northern Ireland Parliament and devolved off various functions to the Northern Ireland Parliament, and for the next 50 years it was run by the Ulster Unionist Party, or the majority element in that Parliament, the Stormont regime. And as you know, housing and justice and control of policing were passed, devolved to Stormont. And that gave rise to 50 years of civil liberties abuses, particularly in relation to the nationalist Catholic population. You're generally familiar, I'm sure, with the issues which the civil rights movement sought to oppose and get rid of. There was the gerrymandering of constituencies, whereby nationalist majority towns such as Derry, Enniskillen and Dungannon were in continual unionist control. This was facilitated by a plural franchise in municipal elections, whereby ratepayers could have up to 6 votes, which helped the unionist side. And of course then when you had local authorities gerrymandered, you had a significant discrimination in the allocation of housing and in jobs generally, in public sector jobs and so on, under the Stormont regime. The Irish flag, it was illegal to fly under the Special Powers Act. The Special Powers Act itself, of course, gave powers to the Northern administration to ban public meetings, ban organisations which are regarded as nefarious in character. And of course, in the aftermath of the IRA's 56-61 border campaign, there was significant internment where several hundred people, 250 or so people, were interned without charge or trial, some of them for years on end. And you had, of course, the Special Constabulary, a predominantly, overwhelmingly Protestant force, which was sometimes used to bully, whereby local people could bully their Catholic neighbours. These were a whole list of grievances which constituted Northern Britain's political slum in Northern Ireland, to use a phrase that was current at the time. And there was a happy convention whereby members of Parliament from Britain itself could not raise at Westminster any issue that was devolved to the Northern Ireland administration. So while MPs, there were 12 MPs from the north of Ireland in Westminster in those days, while MPs from Belfast could raise any issue relating to Birmingham or Manchester, MPs from Birmingham or Manchester could not raise anything devolved to the Northern administration. That was a happy way of letting sleeping dogs lie. And they lay low, so to speak, for 50 years, despite various attempts by various progressive elements to try and draw attention to these abuses. What the civil rights movement did was to overthrow that system, to get rid of those abuses, to establish in principle a regime of equality of treatment and parity of esteem, to use the current phrases. At least those reforms to bring that situation about was agreed by the old Stormont administration under Captain O'Neill, under pressure from the British government and from the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland itself. It's a pity there's not a book of the civil rights movement. There's no up-to-date comprehensive account that would do justice to this complex and many-sided movement. There are many elements in it. There are various memoirs by various people. Desmond Greaves himself wrote a book, The Irish Crisis, in 1971, which was translated into several languages. The late Con McCluskey of the Campaign for Social Justice in Dungannon wrote a memoir about the Campaign for Social Justice, which was a middle 60s development. Eamon McCann and Bernard Devlin, Michael Farrell have written memoirs relating to people's democracy element and so on. But there's no comprehensive view, and there's very much need for a decent study of the civil rights movement. And any such study would have to do justice to the British side of things, because these reforms that were exacted from the Six County administration in 69, 70 were the result, of course, of the civil rights movement itself within the North under the auspices of NICRA and other groupings, but also because the British Labour government of Harold Wilson at the time was under heavy pressure from its own backbenchers, a significant number of whom had been educated about the situation in the six counties over the previous 10 or 15 years. And that work was primarily done by the County Association under the leadership of the late Desmond Greaves, who of course edited the County Association's monthly journal, The Irish Democrat, from 1951 to 1988 when he died. And it was his sole source of income. He depended upon the Sage, the Democrat, for his income. He wasn't dependent on anybody else at that time. So Desmond Greaves, after whom this school is called, is well known as a historian, but his role in the role generally of the British Solidarity movement has been underplayed, has been largely ignored by historians, but needs to be drawn attention to if there's to be proper historical account of the civil rights movement. Desmond Greaves was, of course, a member of the CPGB all his adult life. As he said on several occasions, he was always interested more in issues of imperialism and national self-determination than in issues of socialism. So far as I know, he never set foot on the continent of Europe in the course of his life, though he did know these islands very well. He had family connections with Ireland, and as an adult political activist, he was primarily concerned with trying to undo partition, or to try and make a policy of working towards the reunification of Ireland the mainstream central policy of the British Labour movement, which was primarily, of course, the Labour Party, the trade unions, and, of course, the CPGB itself. The CPGB, incidentally, was the only party, of course, in Britain of any significance that actually favoured Irish unification in its programme, and that, of course, is worth bearing in mind as part of the background to the British Solidarity movement. Greaves joined the County Association during the war years. The County Association was established in 1938. Next year will be its 80th anniversary, and it's worth, I think, maybe the Greaves School might consider having a look at the County Association and examining that. It's still with us. 2 or 3 or several members of the association came here this weekend, and we're happy to have the General Secretary of the Association, Mick Carty, as a member of the committee of this summer school. So the County Association is still in existence 20 years more or less after Desmond Greaves had died. But Greaves joined, he went full-time as Irish Democrat editor in 1951, but he and colleagues of his, of course, under his influence in large part, adopted a new constitution for the association in 1955. And this new constitution, which is the current constitution of the association, outlaws the affiliation of the association with any political party. And it sets out what the purposes of the association are. There are 2, essentially: to defend the interests of the Irish in Britain. And the prime way of defending the interests of the Irish in Britain, it saw as urging those Irish people who were employees to join trade unions, to join their appropriate trade unions and play a part in their self-defence in the trade union movement. And the second purpose was to try and win support in Britain for a progressive policy on Ireland by the British government, which entailed trying to influence the Labour Party and trade union movement in particular, ultimately, ideally, to support the working towards the reunification of Ireland, but in the meantime to try and highlight the abuses that went on under the Stormont regime. Because Greaves was of the view there are logically only 2 ways of uniting Ireland. You either do so by physical force, if you've got enough physical force to do it. That's not desirable. It's divisive, it causes mayhem, and so on. And it can't succeed because one's basically taking on NATO, as he put it. And the only other way was to try and bring about a situation where, over time, one might hope that a majority of people in the north of Ireland would come to the view that they shared a common political orientation with their nationalist fellow countrymen. That required, of course, the getting rid of sectarianism, getting rid of these abuses that I've outlined at the start, and creating a situation where, over time at least, a section of current unionist opinion would shift towards a more nationalist-oriented approach. There was no other alternative, and there isn't any other alternative. So that was the idea he advanced through the conversation. He was always very solicitous of the independence of the association, and this campaign began in 1955. I shook the dust of Cork off and UCC off my feet in 1958 and emigrated to Britain and spent 3 years there. I was brought along to a conversational meeting on my first night in London it would be about October 1958, a long time ago. And I got very active in the association. I was its full-time organiser for about a year or so. And at that time, the association was seeking to draw attention to the fact that there were a couple of hundred internees in the north of Ireland who had been involved in the IRA campaign of 56-61, interned without charge or trial. Greaves discovered, or thought on the point, that a number of these were British trade unionists or members of British trade unions. And he documented that, found information, and the conversation was going around to British trade unions to tell them that, do you know that some of your members are interned for years without charge or trial in a part of the United Kingdom known as Northern Ireland? And this was a great shock to people who heard that message, because, of course, the ignorance of the situation in the north throughout Britain itself was abysmal, including in labour and trade union circles, who you thought might know better. So that campaign was on when I was in England. And by 61, over half the Parliamentary Labour Party, it was the opposition at the time, Macmillan was in government, over half the Parliamentary Labour Party signed a succession of telegrams to Lord Brookborough, the Northern Prime Minister, calling for the release of the internees. And they were significantly embarrassing to the unionists, and they were in due course released. So this happened in 61, long before there was any development in the north of Ireland itself. And during the 1960s, that campaign continued. The late Sean Redmond was General Secretary of the Association throughout that time, and he describes some of the elements of that campaign in his book. The conversation was, of course, affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties, which is a major British body, very respectable and with a lot of support. Also the movement for colonial freedom. In those days, Britain had quite a number of colonies. And that was a way of leveraging the message of the theme that there were these abuses going on in the north of Ireland, which the British needed intervention by Britain and by the British Parliament to get rid of them. So Greaves also, of course, had an indirect influence on some of the northern trade unionists who were active in setting up the NICRA. The late Betty Sinclair, who was full-time organiser and secretary of the Belfast Trades Council, was, of course, a CP person from the north of Ireland, and there are a number of other trade unionists, mostly left-wing people. The late Noel Harris, who was in the Draftsmen's Union, for example, and who was, I think, the second chairman of the NICRA, would also have been influenced by him on a personal basis, as indeed I was. When I came back to Dublin in 1961, I was asked by Greaves to act as a Dublin correspondent for the Irish Democrat. I sent a monthly column for that paper from 1961 till the paper closed down in the early 2000s. There's a column every month, more or less, from yours truly. My own political involvement in the 60s was largely in the Wolfe Tone Society, which a number of you here have heard about. The Wolfe Tone Society was an important element in encouraging the politicisation of the then Republican movement during the 1960s. This of course, was the pre-split Republican movement led by the late Thomas McGilla and Conor Goulding. And Wolfe Tone Society was a kind of green think tank in which various Republicans, mostly independent ones, not affiliated organisationally, and various left-wingers interacted and urged various improvements or reforms or changes in the local situation. There are no more than about a couple of dozen members of the Wolfe Tone Society in Dublin, and there will be less than a dozen, I'd say, in the Belfast branch. But it advocated things like saving the Tailors' Hall, abolishing ground rents, which Seamus O'Toole was very much involved in at the time, saving bits of Georgia in Dublin, campaigning against membership of the EEC, and of course civil rights in the north of Ireland. This is a particular interest which I had as a result of my conversation, connection and involvement, which the Belfast branch was more active in that respect. The NICRA, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, whose 50th anniversary is this year, January was the initial meeting where it was proposed, and in April there was a meeting to adopt this constitution. It didn't do an awful lot in the first year. It made representations to the Stormont government and others. But it came, of course, very much to the fore in 1968, about 50 years back from next year, when, of course, you had the civil rights marches, which brought the abuses in the north of Ireland to the attention of the world. The two ideological streams, you might say, went into the formation of NICRA. There were the Republican politicizers who supported the idea of a civil rights campaign, Goulding and McGill and company, and their local people in the north of Ireland. And people from the Old Tone Society in Belfast, particularly the late Fred Heatley and Jack Bennett, who were on the original committee of the NICRA. Heatley was an independent nationalist, and Bennett was an independent, at the time, was an independent journalist of Protestant background. And then the other ideological stream was, of course, a section of the Belfast trade union movement, mostly left-wing people, several CP people, Betty Sinclair being the best known as the full-time secretary of the Trades Council with a long experience of working class agitation in the north of Ireland going back to the 30s, and the late Noel Harris, as I said. So these two elements, so to speak, came together in the formation of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. There were a number of meetings which have been documented leading up to its formation. There was a public meeting in the War Memorial Hall in Belfast in November 1966. And I remember Cadrazwell spoke at it, the late Kieran McAnally from here, and Professor Dolly from Queen's University, and the late John D. Stewart, who was a local litterateur in the north, the public meeting, proposing, and from that there was a talk, we need to set up a civil rights movement, rather similar to the National Council for Civil Liberties in Britain. And the founding meeting was then, there was a coming together in January 1967 in the former International Hotel behind what's now Belfast City Hall. The hotel is gone. And Tony Smythe, who was General Secretary of the British National Council for Civil Liberties, spoke at the initial meeting and outlined what a civil liberties organisation and campaign could do. And of course, this was extremely novel. The achievement of the civil rights movement was to adopt a mode of politics different from what had been adopted before, particularly by Democrats and nationalists in the north of Ireland. The Unionist administration was well used to dealing with the IRA. They locked them up or interned them, and they could put them in their place without too much difficulty, particularly after the major IRA campaign, 56-61. Also, they were able to deal with the Nationalist Party. Periodically, the old Nationalist Party would abstain from Stormont because they weren't getting anywhere or not making any impact, or their representations would be ignored. They'd abstain periodically. But they didn't really change the situation significantly. But this was a new theme, British rights for British citizens, that if the North of Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, that the citizens there, whether they're nationalists or unionists, should have the same rights as their opposite numbers who are also citizens of the UK in Britain. Now this was a very dangerous and difficult and new situation for the Stormont regime. The civil rights movement was not raising the constitutional question, it was not raising the partition issue, that was being put aside. And some of them might have wanted to do so, said later on we'll do that, we'll raise this if times are appropriate. But we'll concentrate on British rights for British citizens. And this was it made sense from the point of view of British public opinion. And if it could be if the profile of those advocating that or that particular demand could be raised, it was likely to get international support. And also, this was a time when both Britain and Ireland had applied to join the EEC. The application from both states came in 1961, and during the 60s, of course, de Gaulle had vetoed British membership. But it was going to rise again, and here the two governments were now going to be partners in this new supranational union. And that was part of the background, I expect, to the British government saying we have to take account of Dublin's susceptibilities in relation to these matters. And we can't just stand over this dreadful situation, which is now being highlighted by all these agitators in Britain and who are getting at the Labour backbenchers. And you had a whole lot of Labour backbenchers, some quite well known. They mostly tended to be on the left, but not entirely. There were some Liberal supporters of the civil rights demands, a couple of Liberal MPs in the 60s. And it was so Harold Wilson, of course, got into office as a Labour government in 1964. And the Condensation campaign and the National Council for Civil Liberties and the MCF and groups like that, and the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster, which was initiated by some Labour Party members of the association, but they were pressing these Labour MPs to do something about the 6 counties. So Wilson was coming under pressure. There are two dates I'd like you to bear in mind, 1949 and 1969. In 1949, 3 or 4 years after the end of World War II, the Westminster Parliament passed the Ireland Act. It was a response to the declaration of the Republic here by the coalition government of Costello and Company. And the Ireland Act said there shall be no change in the constitutional position of Northern Ireland without the consent of the Parliament of Northern Ireland, without giving the Stormont Parliament a seeming veto on changes in the constitutional position. That was 49. It was a Labour government, the post-war Labour government under Attlee. Morrison was the Home Secretary. And at that time, of course, Labour was looking very favourably on the 6 counties, on the Unionists that supported the war effort. And Labour was very much behind the Union, as shown by the Ireland Act. That was 49. In 69, the civil rights movement developed in the 6 counties. You had the marches of 68, 69. And there was a very, you had, of course, the emergence of the civil rights movement itself, this public opinion in Britain and later internationally, when the thing was highlighted more, was behind the civil writers. 20 years change. What changed things in about 20 years? Largely, I think, it was the movement in Britain, changed British public opinion. But of course, then when the marches began, and particularly after the October the 5th march in 1968, that, as you know, the television cameras showed the police battening the marches. There were 3, Gerry Fitt had brought 3 British Labour MPs over to be in the front line of the march. And it was world news overnight. The thing exploded. And O'Neill, who was the local Stormont Prime Minister, was under major pressure, of course, to concede the demands of the civil rights movement of the NICRA. They were set out in that article there, the specific demands: 1 person, 1 vote, an end to gerrymandering, an end to discrimination in housing, an end to the Special Powers Act, etc. And of course, Harold Wilson was saying, you must do this. So O'Neill was under pressure from the grassroots movement in the 6 counties and from the Labour backbenches and the British government responding to Labour pressure from the backbenches in London. And that was the result of this development, particularly after the October the 5th march in Derry. The NICRA was a kind of umbrella organisation, as it modelled initially at least on the civil rights, on the National Council for Civil Liberties. Its first committee had a member of every party in the north of Ireland. It had a young unionist for a period. I think it lasted about 3 months before he was got at. But in the meeting in April 1967, when they elected the committee, they co-opted, I think, this young unionist. I think his name was Robert Hoof. So it had a broad representation. And then, of course, the next step was when you had the Caledon incident, where Austin Curry and some Republicans from the Brand-Tree Republican Club sat in on these houses in Caledon near Dungannon, highlighting local discrimination, the allocation of housing, and as I said, they appealed to the civil rights, NICRA, to sponsor the first civil rights march, which was from Coal Island to Dungannon in August 28. And then in October, you had the Derry Housing Action Committee and various other elements of Derry wanting to have a demonstration and asking or requesting the NICRA executive to sponsor that. So NICRA sponsored the first civil rights marches in response to local feeling. It was very difficult for the unionist government, of course, to deal with this situation. O'Neill had to change. The title generally is, it was a lost opportunity. The disaster, of course, was the Republican split in 1970 in response to the rise in sectarianism, the violence that then occurred in 69. And the Republican movement split, and you had the formation of the provisional provisional IRA and provisional Sinn Féin. And things changed quite quickly. In 68, 69, I think it's fair to say that British public opinion, United Kingdom public opinion, and generally international public opinion was behind the civil rights people. The Catholics, nationalists were being oppressed and discriminated against. The British government had tolerated these abuses. The Paisley movement was regarded as provocative and stirring things up. This was from the point of view of the British international public opinion. That was 68, 69. 71, 72, the problem had become containing IRA terrorism. That the IRA were the baddies, and everyone else who was against them were okay. So in quite a short time, you had a big shift in public mood, largely a result, I think, of the provisional campaign, provisional movement embarking on a campaign of attempting to expel the British government by force from Ireland, and implicitly trying to reunite Ireland and coerce, if you like, the Unionists into United Ireland. It's a bit of a paradox that having spent 25 years trying to expel the British from the north of Ireland and implicitly coerce the Unionists into United Ireland, that the current stand of the provisional Sinn Féin, of their successors, is not, Ulster must not be coerced into leaving the European Union. It's a paradox. However, that's a complex development that would seek to explain that. But there's no doubt that the provisional campaign was a disaster. 3,000 or so people killed, 30,000 or more households moved at that time. The place became more ghettoized, more divided then than now. I think it's fair to say that the North of Ireland is much more a divided society now, at least in terms of ghettoization, than it was then. And of course you have all the hurt and horror and misery of the 30 years that intervened. So that brings us, of course, to the present. It was, I think, a lost opportunity. Could the violence have been avoided? Was there any concatenation of circumstance that might have prevented the mayhem that between 1971 and, say, the middle 90s? I remember putting that question to the late Bobby Heatley. Bobby Heatley has a Protestant background, was in the College Station as a young man. He then went back to Belfast teaching, and he was come to this school quite often in his early days. And I remember Bobby saying, no, he said, there was so much sectarian tinder had built up during the 60s, and so much resentment piled up on the nationalist side against the situation they were in, and there were a new educated generation of younger people coming to the fore, that there was bound to be an explosion of some kind. I asked the same question of Desmond Greaves himself. Desmond Greaves' view was that the great regret was that the civil rights movement didn't get going a bit earlier than 68, 9. There was a conference way back in 1965 under the auspices of the Belfast Trades Council on civil liberties. The trade unions, some of them were very cautiously beginning to raise issues about civil liberties in the north. Belfast Trades Council particularly, they had this conference. I remember Greaves going over to it as a visitor, and at it the trade unionists, who were mostly Protestant background, of course, and some of them would be quite left-wing, but the Republicans attended, the Sinn Féin people attended, the Republican clubs were represented at that, or attended that, and they spelled out their grievances to the representatives of the trade unions at that conference. And then all the various parties involved went back and went away and were supposed to report back to another conference. And the Northern Ireland Labour Party never reported back, so nothing happened. The Northern Ireland Labour Party was, of course, very influential in labour and trade union circles at that time, and nothing came from that. But it was a lost initiative. It might have been. Greaves said, well, the great thing about 1965, 6 and 7 was what did not happen. There was not a civil liberties or civil rights movement in the north of Ireland. In those 3 years, sectarian temperature rose. The Paisley movement got wind behind its sails, particularly in 1966, which was the 5th anniversary of the 16 Rising, gave rise to various incidents which raised the sectarian temperature. The Republicans got more impatient with their situation, and so when the civil rights movement got going, as Greaves' view was that the Republicans were not able to kind of keep control of things, and certainly not able to keep control of the people's democracy, the young students and far left-wing people who got going. Whereas he said if things had got going a bit earlier under the auspices of the trade union movement, maybe the violence might have been contained, or the bitterness, and one might have been able to maintain more unity, because the trade unionists would have been able to deal better with the ultra-left of the people's democracy. That was his particular view of that. But that's a might have been, a counterfactual. Nobody knows or can say dogmatically what might have happened. One can only speculate of what might have been. But certainly it was a terrible tragedy. And a lost opportunity. And in a sense, we're now back after 25 years of the struggle of the Sinn Féin and IRA provisional movement. we're back in general to a kind of civil rights type situation, civil rights redivivus, as somebody put it, whereby it's generally accepted by all parties of any significance that there must be equality of treatment and parity of esteem between both communities. That's the only basis upon which they can live together, and the only basis upon which over time one might hope and work towards getting a situation where at least some of the unionist population might rediscover the political implications of their Irishness. Because we regard them as Irish people. They're British citizens, of course, but every North Ireland's a British citizen. But what are the political implications of their Irishness? I think it's a much more difficult situation, more backward situation now than it was then. But that's the result of the intervening events. But there's no other way, of course, of getting United Ireland than winning over at least a section of current unionist opinion to accepting that that is the best outcome for all the people of this island and for the current unionist community itself. We're far from that at the moment, but that's the question posed by the civil rights movement and its efforts in those dramatic years, 1967 to 1971 too, about which Kevin will talk about the latter period of the civil rights movement. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tony, for that very interesting and stimulating talk. I think we'll hold off on Q&A till the end. And the next speaker is Kevin McCurry, who well known to you all, organiser of NICRA from 1969 to 1975, and I think, to quote the aforementioned Sean O'Casey, he could certainly say, "I seen things, doctor, I seen things." So I'm looking forward to his account of the day-to-day role that he played in that very dramatic time. Kevin McCurry.
We opened a NICRA office in Marquis Street, that's off Castle Street in Belfast city centre, at the end of 1969. We being myself and Madge Davison, who subsequently went on. Well, first of all, she continued on after I left civil rights, continued on, then went on to pursue a legal career. And as Seamus O'Toole said there recently, had she lived now, she would have been probably one of the most eminent members of the Northern Ireland Bar, but unfortunately it was not to be. But anyway, the two of us opened the Civil Rights Office, and the Civil Rights Office was at the top of a flight of stairs, the door, and then you went up the flight of stairs and there was the office there. And we had, in fact, I think we were just in the process of getting the stuff into the office when we had two visitors. And the two visitors were not visitors that you would have assumed would have been the first visitors to a civil rights office, given the sectarianism that had occurred all in '69 and all the rest of it. The two visitors were two members of the Northern Ireland Parliament. One was a barrister by the name of Desmond Bowl, who was the MP for Shankill. And the other one was a more colourful figure. It's John McQuaid, or Johnny McQuaid. And Johnny had started off as a British soldier. He had fought at Dunkirk and through the Burma campaign. He then had become a professional boxer, a city councillor for the official Unionist Party, and he at that stage was an MP. And what was the concern of the two men was the fact that there had been, following the publication of the Hunt report and the Hunt recommendations in relation to the proposals for the reform, the RUC, get rid of the B specials and so on, and all those proposals that had taken there. There had been demonstrations on the Shankill Road. The demonstrations had led to rioting. The UVF had come out and shot the first RUC, member of the RUC, a man called Victor Arbuthnot. But the point they were making was that they were not condoning the killing of Constable Arbuthnot, but that there was serious civil rights issues, overreaction by the policing. The whole policing operation had been an overreaction to what had started off as what they would have considered and what was legitimate protest. And what they were concerned about was the fact that the police overreaction. And they cited the example of the killing of Samuel Devaney earlier on in 1969, when after a civil rights demonstration in Derry, the RUC had run amok, broken into Samuel Devaney's house, beat him senseless in front of his children, and he had died 3 months later. The attempts by the family to get redress were foiled on every time, every occasion. And at the end of the day, the RUC, or the authorities, said that they couldn't prosecute any members of the RUC because of a conspiracy of silence among the members of the RUC involved. And Bole and McQuaid wanted to make sure that whatever about the seriousness of the killing of Constable Arbuthnot, that would not happen in relation to the Shankill Road incidents. So Madge and myself, for the next 3 to 4 weeks at least, as far as I can recall, faithfully every Saturday morning went up to the Shankill Road Orange Hall, where we used to help in the taking of statements, which were then going to be put together and compiled into a dossier. And that we worked on that and so on. Now, it wasn't in the scale of things. I'm not making any grandiose claims about civil rights breaking down sectarian barriers in this instance or whatever. I'm simply citing this as just a small example of what could have been. But remember what was coming next, because 1970 was coming next. And 1970 was the pivotal year when civil rights effectively became defunct. That would be my sad political statement to you all, for a number of reasons. We can talk about the violence. That was clearly there. There was the continuation. Remember, 69 ended right the whole way, right away into 1969. You had serious rioting and so on, and an consequent increased sectarianism. But then you had, Tony has alluded to it, you had the Republican split. You had the fact that the people who went to, I'm just stating this, I'm not making a political judgment about the position that they took, but the people who went in to form the provisionals did not support the concept of civil rights. Now, I can understand that given the split and given the bitterness between the officials and the provisionals, and the sense that I remember provisionals would be coming into the NICRA office and would be coming into, eye up what was going on, who you were, and all this sort of stuff. I'm not making any judgment about that, but the line, the political line that they were pushing was not one about civil rights, because their concept was that the strategy that they were engaging in was a strategy to drive the Brits out. So there was no in between. It was now, and it was armed struggle, and the Brits go out. And many of you, I'm sure, are old enough to remember the Éire Nua programme. The Éire Nua programme in relation to the whole decentral. It was a programme for government for an All Ireland. So there was no sort of intermediate proposals in relation to Northern Ireland. So that was a factor. Then you had the emergence of political parties in 1970. Remember, 1970 saw the emergence of the Alliance Party, which effectively came out of the New Ulster movement, which was effectively O'Neill unionism. And you had the emergence of the SDNLP, which came out of the independents who were elected, like John Hume and so on. Social Democrats like Jerry Fitt, Paddy Devlin, and members of the old Nationalist Party. And while they still continued to be involved in NICRA, their perspective had moved beyond the idea of a united campaign which mobilised people in non-party political popular struggle to a reliance on electoral politics, getting elected, getting into a position where they would be able to negotiate directly with government. And this suited the British government. It may not have, obviously the Unionist administration in Stormont, they were the political opposition. But as regards Westminster preferred to deal with political parties rather than to deal with organisations like the Civil Rights. I remember we went out when Callaghan came on his first visit to Northern Ireland, and he stayed out in the Conway Hotel out in Dunmurry. And like Egypts, we went out to try and meet him. And he came out like the Viceroy of India, as only a Labour Party politician can act the imperial, the imperial Lord and Master. And he gave us a pep talk. I practically patted us on the head, and then he went back into his advisors, and that was it. But that was again only peanuts. But effectively, it was more conducive for government to be talking to political parties. So therefore, although groups like the SDNLP would have continued to come to the meetings of civil rights and so on, you could see that their heart increasingly was not in it. that was important. And again, in terms of the composition of the NICRA executive, at the AGM of the beginning of 1970, three people who were very well respected members of that executive and who subsequently went to become members of and leading members of the SDNLP did not go forward for election, alleging that there was a non-Jew left-wing influence in the NICRA in the NICRA executive. So as the 70s progressed, NICRA's influence, it has to be said, declined. Remember, by 1970, most of the demands which Tony outlines in one of those documents, most of those demands, early civil rights demands, had been put on the statute book or were in the process of coming or being put on the statute book. Now, I'm not claiming that they were being put on the statute book by a happy, smiling administration that was only too anxious to implement reform. But what I'm saying was they were put on the statute book as a consequence of the pressures we were talking about, international opinion, support within the British Labour movement, and so on. But as the 70s progressed, while those issues had become more and more resolved, and you know, in the franchise, it go through the whole thing, one person, one vote, and so on. It became the issue of security policy and the legislation and the practices of a militarised and increasingly militarised Northern Ireland. And while you could hold your demonstration outside the police station, protesting at the arrest of someone or whatever, by and large, those demonstrations became less and less popularly supported. The introduction of internment was in fact a swan song for NICRA. In fact, surprisingly, NICRA had the biggest paper membership at the time of the introduction of internment, which was 500 members, which was the maximum that NICRA had at any particular time, which was 500 paid up members of NICRA, divided into local branches. You had your Derry branch, and part of my job was simply going each night to the various various branches. But the important thing, and NICRA became the focal point for the campaign against internment, and called for and got massive support for a rent and rate strike, for a campaign of civil disobedience, and eventually for a series of demonstrations, one of which was Bloody Sunday. But the point about it was that NICRA, while it was on paper, was identified as the leading organisation for that for the campaign. Actually, politically, it didn't and wasn't able to dictate the stand of the component parts of that campaign. And one of the main indicators of that was that from day one of the rent and rate strike and the campaign against internment, the agreed position, which was agreed by all the anti-internment forces, was that there would be no talks with the authorities until internment was ended. That was the agreed position, and that was not pie in the sky politics. That was just simple, basic, sensible politics. But unfortunately, you had the meetings with the provisionals with the British government, and then you had the SDLP said, well, if they can do it, we can do it. So that just was dissipated. Bloody Sunday was lots has been written about Bloody Sunday and the Widgery and the Savile Inquiry. But it was ironic that we ended up the way we had come in, where we'd been in the Shankill Road taking statements about the Arbuthnot riots. We ended up taking statements about Bloody Sunday from the relatives, and trying to get justice for them. Oh yes, there's just one thing, and I know this doesn't follow logically, but it maybe goes to explain what Tony had mentioned there earlier as a strand in the civil rights movement. And I discovered a reference to a NAD which appeared in 1964. It was for a recruitment ad for Belfast Cables. And the application form, and I'm trying to use this to illustrate that discrimination was not simply about Catholics and their access to the thing. There were also other victims of the whole discriminatory process. And the more advanced of trade unionists saw this and was part of the dynamic that went towards their involvement in civil rights. So anyway, the application form is for Belfast Cables. And the application form asks for name, address, and the name, address, and religion. That's the first thing. Further down the form, the application form asked, are you or have you been a member of a trade union? If yes, state the name of the union or unions. The form then continued, this factory is worked on an open shop principle, and membership or otherwise of a trade union is a matter for the individual. Completion of this form signifies your willingness to accept our conditions of employment. And below that, some trade unionist commented, so trade unionists and those who dig with the wrong foot could expect a frosty reception from the management of Belfast Cables. So that strand, and that was, one of the weaknesses. There's no question or doubt about that. That was the fundamental weakness of civil rights. It's all might have beens, I know. was that NICRA and civil rights and so on did not tap into that. And those who went around waving red flags and all the rest of it, they weren't doing progressives in that Northern Ireland any favours. Thanks, William.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and most interesting. We're now going to have a bit of a question and answer discussion, and would you please identify yourself and any organisation you care to be associated with.
Religion or trade union.
No religion or trade union required. We'll know by looking at you anyway. So, the gentleman here in the